I think we're good.
We're live. Awesome. Hello, welcome to our AMA, Ask Me Anything session. We're excited to present this for the North American audience. We've got two of our wonderful Pact and Pactflow people here this morning to speak to you about everything contract testing. We've got Beth and Matt. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. Just letting you know that we'll be recording this session just so we can share the content that we deliver with other members of our community. We've got three questions that have come up as quite popular through the Pact Slack channel, which we'll be asking. And then as attendees join, you're more than welcome to ask your question either via the chat function here in Google Hangouts or just take yourself off of mute. So I will hand over to Matt and Beth. You can introduce yourselves and then I will kick off with the questions.
Sure. Okay, I'll go first. My name is Matt Fellows. I'm the core maintainer of Pact.js, one of the co-maintainers of Pact.js and Pact.go, but also just fairly involved in the community at large, and also co-founders with Beth and Ron of Pactflow.
Hi, I'm Beth. I am also one of the co-founders of Pactflow. I am one of the longest running Pact maintainers. I look after the Pact Ruby implementation and the Pact broker.
Lovely. And I didn't introduce myself, Alicia. I worked with the Pactflow team in a product marketing capacity. So Kumar, I can see that you've joined. Just wondering, wanted to give you the opportunity to ask a question if you wanted to before we kicked off the three that we've got to talk through.
Yeah, of course. Hello, all. This is Kumar. Yeah, actually, I'm calling from Amsterdam, so it's too late for me. So that's why it's a bit late for me, but still I'm quite interested for this session. So hopefully I have a few questions, so I will certainly going to ask, like if you guys allow me to ask about it.
Yeah, please.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I want to know, like, as I know, like contact testing is a kind of service level testing. And functional testing is completely different, because in functional testing, we also verify all the negative scenarios. But here in our contact testing, do we have any facility to do the negative testing also while creating our contract?
Might get you to elaborate on that a little bit if you could. Are you saying, can you do more native testing as part of your contract testing? So are you saying, is there a facility to do more functional testing as part of your contract test?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
can I just get a clarification? Do you mean on the consumer side or on the provider side?
Okay. So there is an agreement. Like contract is an agreement in between consumer as well as the provider. Okay. So even though if a provider changes anything, then there is a conflict between contract. So it is certainly going to fail if we are not going to change our contract. Okay, this is our first scenario. So let's see, like provider changes something and he didn't intimate to the consumer, and he tries to push to the production side. It will certainly going to fail, because it is not going to fulfill the agreement of the contract. Yeah. So this is my first scenario, but I want to know, like, whether in our testing, do we like because at the provider side we are only doing some of the unit testing. We are only verifying the whether contract is correct or not. But in the contract, while generating our contract, do we have any facility to add also the negative scenarios, like not only the status code as okay, or like can we also test for some negative scenarios also?
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by native scenarios, but I think what you're asking is, can you add extra tests to check for things that aren't covered in the contract? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so contract testing fits in with all your other testing tools. So obviously you'd probably be aware of the testing pyramid Is that a familiar concept to you? No, maybe I'll just go over the testing pyramid very quickly. So it's this concept, and if you imagine a triangle, it's this concept that we like to have lots of very fast to run, low cost, low commitment tests down the bottom, unit tests, and we like to keep the number of end-to-end tests that hit all the paths in our code quite small, and that as you go up the pyramid, you have lots of different types of testing at different levels. But you want to keep, thank you, Matt, for bringing up the testing pyramid diagram. You want to keep the unit, keep doing a lot of the fast tests and fewer of the expensive slow tests. So in answer to your question, I would say no, contract testing is just focusing on the task of testing that the requests and responses are in agreement, that both sides have a shared understanding. You want to use your other tools to supplement that. So contract tests very deliberately do not check for side effects. So things like, if I send this particular request, does this entity that the request represents actually get saved correctly to the database? So contract tests are deliberately agnostic of that type of concern. So you still would want your functional tests for the provider that check that the provider is actually doing the right thing with the request. All the contract test cares about is, does the response look like the consumer expects? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, like I followed everything, whatever you explained me. But I have one more question. Like, while generating our contract, we generally used to verify only the positive scenarios. So can we also add some of the negative scenarios, like 400 or 401 kind of thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I'm writing a contract test for an endpoint, I always do the success scenario. If there's any validation, I'll do a validation failure scenario. If there are any other kind of unusual responses like redirects or 302s or different variations, I will always try and cover all of those. So I won't necessarily cover a 500 response and a 403 for every endpoint, but I will make sure that I know what a 500 response looks like, because perhaps with a 500 response, there's going to be a particular error body and error messages. So I want to know what that looks like. And if there's a 403, perhaps there's a particular error message that comes back that I should be displaying to the user. So I will always cover at least one of the failure scenarios for that service, as well as covering the success and success response for every endpoint and any validation failure. So I don't try and cover every validation failure. I just pick one pretty stable one that I'm using to check for the shape of the validation response. I'm not testing all the different variations in the validation rules. I just want to know what the response looks like when a validation failure happens.
So Beth, can I ask a question on top of that, just to expand the question? So in the case of like most APIs, right, you're going to have consistent sets of error codes that are going to go across all of them. So let's say you've got an ordering API or something. There might be different endpoints that deal with, creating orders and deleting orders and updating them and whatever. Now they're all probably going to have hopefully you're going to have some level of consistency in terms of the kinds of errors that can happen. How do you do that? Do you per endpoint repeat this for 401s, the 403s, the 500s, and so on? How do you look to deal with those situations? Do you repeat the test, or do you sort of have one endpoint which kind of has all the extra endpoints, all the extra negative scenarios tested, and then do you just leave them there, or do you repeat those for all the endpoints?
This is a question for me.
Yep. For you, Beth.
I tend not to. I figure that a 500 response is going to look pretty much the same for the entire service, unless I know not every service has consistent error handling. So depending on my knowledge of the particular service, if my experience leads me to believe that the errors are actually going to be different for each endpoint, then maybe I would put in extra handling, extra use cases for the different types of error responses. But if my experience leads me to believe that there is one error handler and it does all the 500s, and every 500 that I've ever seen has the same pattern, I'm just going to test that once. The same for a 403 or 401.
Makes sense. Does that help, Kimmer?
Yeah. It's quite clear to me now. Yeah. Thank you so much for clarifying my doubt. Yeah.
No worries.
You're welcome. I've also just got this link here about consumer tests and how they're not functional tests, and kind of some more words and thinking around that. So we'll paste that in the channel as well. Hope that's helpful. And that actually answered, I think, one of our questions already, didn't it, Alicia?
I believe it did, yes. Yeah. Very good, kicking off well. So maybe we'll jump on to the next one. So how can I test optimal fields? Sorry, optional fields, excuse me.
Yeah, you did say that. I knew what you meant.
Yeah, that's tricky. I tend to do one request at least that covers absolutely every field that I know could possibly be there. Yeah. So I definitely know that I've got the name of the optional field correct. But then I wouldn't necessarily include all those optional fields in every variation or every instance of that request. Now, there's a reason why we don't have the ability to say this is an optional field in the contract. And that is because if we say this is an optional field, and for every single instance of our verification, that field is never there, we've never actually proven that it could be there. So the difference between contract testing and schema testing is that the schema kind of gives you this definition of every single possibility of what an endpoint could look like, whereas a contract is always a concrete example of what an endpoint does look like in this particular situation. So we need to always have at least one concrete example that has that field in it to prove that that field actually is there and is what we think it is. So that's why there's no explicit support within Pact for saying this is an optional attribute. What you can do is just not put it in the expectation for every request. If it's something that, I don't know, isn't going to be populated often in the provider side, you can just leave that expectation out. But make sure you have at least one example where it's in.
If I can elaborate on that as well, Beth. So this question actually came up yesterday in our Ask Me Anything, and Phil asked a similar question, and he's like, well, what's the guidance for it? And it's kind of, there's probably more art than there is science to it, to be honest. But the idea around schemas and sort of how that sort of played a part into all of this. So I think it's probably worth just briefly mentioning it, because a lot of the common, I guess, arguments against the Pact approach is that you use a schema validation tool to do this form of testing. And the problem with that is the schema validation tools don't know what you're actually doing. And so what that means is, let's say you're using an OpenAPI spec or a JSON schema to define your request or response payloads, probably more important on the response payload. Well, given a certain input, what are the exact outputs you get from that? Most of those schema tools that I've seen today in popular circulation don't tell you that. They'll tell you these are the possible outcomes given these possible inputs. And so the problem with that is when you go to verify that your provider actually is compatible with that spec, it doesn't tell you that it doesn't actually tell you at all that you've actually covered all the possible inputs. It might tell you that. It might tell you you've also covered all the possible outputs, but it doesn't know literally which inputs map to which outputs. And so how that maps onto this specific problem is that you don't know, given which inputs, when you're going to get an optional attribute back that's been fulfilled with the value, or the value that comes back that's empty. So really, from a client perspective, there's probably some durability that needs to be built there that they're basically always optional, and you may never get them. That's actually one strategy you should look to do maybe. If it says optional, then you need to assume it never comes back. And if it does come back, well, hey, bonus. Anything else outside of that, you don't have the confidence it's actually going to work. I think the other point was, I think Ron was saying, back in the scope days, you might remember, when your schemas get sufficiently advanced, what happens is you have everything becomes an optional type, and therefore you basically have no types. So you have no information at all what the schema actually does. So we've certainly seen schemas that also devolve into that kind of level of optionality, at which point, you've got to ask yourself what value you're getting from it. So Pact doesn't do it that way. Doesn't mean they can't work together, but Pact is a specification by example. For that very reason is that you get extreme clarity about what your consumers actually need from your providers. There's no ambiguity because the scenarios are laid out for you in front of you. But of course, that comes at a cost. I think that's all I've got to say on this topic as well.
Very good. Shall we jump on to the next question?
Yep.
Okay, so how can I do contract testing when we use API clients and SDKs?
Yeah, so I'll start with this one. Again, this actually came up yesterday in another form, and it prompted me to update this article. So I've done that, and so I figured that would be good to sort of just bring to this conversation. So I'll just elaborate on the question. So particularly in like certain languages have this problem, or maybe not problem. Certain languages encourage this kind of style of API clients more than others. Golang in particular is pretty common to be able to create really small, lightweight API clients and distribute those as packages. But of course, in Java and other languages, you can package those things up and ship them. It's still pretty common. So basically what we're saying is in an internal microservice environment or even public, but we'll just start with internal microservices. Let's say you've got a large number of teams. Your provider team actually ships an SDK or an API client so that your consumers can use that and not have to worry about the implementation details of communicating to the APIs. And you can extend this to things like Amazon, for example, right? Any sort of public API, particularly where things like authentication and security layers and the APIs might be quite complicated to integrate to. Packaging up as an SDK is really, I guess, a nice idea because it sort of removes the need to have to think about all that kind of stuff, HMAC authentication or whatever tokens you use. So you've now packaged things up as an API client. The consumer has it. Well, the question is contract testing still a useful thing to do, given that you're not actually writing the API client? In my mind, it is still valuable. You have some certain decisions you can use to actually, well, you've got some trade-offs you can make here, basically. So the first thing is just to prove the problem. So if your API never changes, or your consumers are always released at the exact same time as your provider, you're probably not going to have a problem because you're going to synchronize your releases, and you can communicate during that synchronization time to say, this is the version of the SDK we're using, this is the version of the SDK we're deploying, and we'll do it all together. And that's what used to happen in the old days. I've certainly spent time with SOAP, where someone would distribute a SOAP client to you, and that would be the new version of the client you needed to use, which was SOAP tended to have this sort of brittle behavior. If any fields weren't documented there, things would blow up. So RESTful services and Postel's Law and whatnot have started to make that a bit easier. But of course, you can still push out a backwards incompatible client SDK, deploy that on the provider side, and the consumer side hasn't yet updated to the new SDK, and therefore you're still actually not compatible. And so that's still a situation that needs to be dealt with, and contract testing can at least help with that, and potentially, depending on how your client SDKs work, a little bit more. So basically, if your API never changes, or if your API does change, or your consumers aren't released at the same time, you may want to look at contract testing because it will prevent this sort of having to synchronize releases, which is one of the main reasons you want to get away from that in the first place. So scrolling down, we've got a few different ways you can do these tests. You can write your contract test using the SDK. And again, this is going to be very specific to the SDK. Some SDKs don't give you the granularity of that, and some SDKs will give you a granularity down to the API calls. So ideally, what you want to be able to do is still write your contract test from your consumer side and just use the endpoints that you need from that provider. If you're testing the full SDK every time, now the provider has to assume you're using and consuming the full API. And so the provider now has to always be backwards compatible with the entire API interface. So that's one thing we'd like to get past, because ideally, with contract testing and Pact, you get full visibility about what every single consumer is using of you, and accurate down to the field level. So you can say that consumer over there, that mobile consumer, for example, is using only those 2 endpoints, and they're only using those fields. Unfortunately, with an SDK, oftentimes you don't get the granularity about what fields you want, but you probably should better get the granularity of the API endpoints you're hitting. So you can still write contract tests at that level. Depending on how the client works, you may or may not be able to do the field level constraint. That's the first thing. So you could still do tests that way. The second thing that we sort of discussed yesterday, and Ron brought this term in front of me, and I've reused it, but I'm not sure if it's true. But we'll iterate on the article afterwards. Is basically we could ship pre-made contracts with the SDK itself. And so I'd had this idea a few months ago when someone was talking about it, and it kind of made sense to me. But then Ron had some words that sort of seemed to give it a label. So I thought maybe I'll use that. And what he called was a technology compatibility kit, a TCK. The idea that you would basically ship tests with the code to make sure it's compatible with its host environment. So we'll dig into that a bit further to see if that's actually a valid thing. Googling it last night, it basically seemed to turn up mostly the Java JSR process. So we'll see if it's actually more applicable outside of that. But the concept is still, I think, useful. So basically what you could do as a provider team is create those SDK client or SDKs or client codes, and you could literally write a consumer, an all-encompassing consumer of that provider, and you can either ship the entire contract testing suite with the SDK, or probably just as simply just ship the contract file. On the consumer side, you then can just upload that contract file with your version of the consumer. So even though, so now we know which version of the SDK every single consumer is using. And so then obviously when you update the SDK, the contract will change with that version. So the provider will know whether or not it's going to break that consumer or not. So that will be a really simple way of doing that. I think that's probably the simplest way. Of course, the downside would be that you now don't know which endpoints the consumer is using. You don't know which fields they're using. But that might be a really good way to get started really quickly. It doesn't require the consumers to create all these new tests, and doesn't require the provider to have to worry about implementing all the provider side tests for that as well. So that will be probably a really rapid way you could actually add contract testing to this scenario, and probably not a bad starting point. That's the first time you've heard that, Beth. Does that sound reasonable to you, or totally crazy?
Yeah, no, that does. Sounds reasonable. I like the idea of shipping a set of the tests that the consumer could then cull the things that they were not interested in. Actually giving them the source codes, they could go, actually, no, I'm not using that. I'm not using that. This is just the bit that I'm interested in. Both options make sense.
Yeah, potentially a way of just like filtering down maybe, or just sort of skipping those tests. Yeah. Look, it's hard to say how to do that in a language agnostic way, but there's got to be some way. Yeah. Lewis gives us the thumbs up, so that's cool. Okay. That's all I had on that topic. Anyone else had anything to add? Or any further questions? Lewis is probably still somehow able to type there, so that's impressive. Kumar, anything from your end?
No, I don't have any more question.
Cool. Well, this has been fun.
Has been. So good. Shall we wrap it up?
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thanks for attending. Appreciate your time. And Matt and Beth, thank you so much for taking the time and answering those questions for us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. See you soon, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all. Bye.
Good luck.
Have a nice day. Yeah, bye.
Thanks. Bye.